page 60, chapter 14. And if you're looking for a book, it's on the shelf. So this is the middle of a conversation. The conversation about the fact that we are now discussing the Beinoni, and one thing that has emerged very clearly at this point in Tanya is that nobody is asking us to be a tzaddik so you can relax. That's no longer an expectation. But there very much is an expectation that we should work to reach the level of a Beinoni. And what we've also discovered is that a Beinoni is not a particularly easy level to achieve. That's what I'm saying. A Beinoni is a very advanced level. And the more we learn about it, the more advanced it turns out to be, which is exactly why this chapter is so critical. Because what he tells us is, and we're building to this point, we haven't yet got there, and I don't even think we'll get there this week, but he's building to the point that what is expected of a tzaddik is a whole different level of mastery than what's expected from a Beinoni. What's expected of a Beinoni is just to train ourselves to have particular thought flows that will keep us from doing things we shouldn't do. And that's where we are right now. We're talking about one of the things that a person can really habituate themselves to think about that will help, rein themselves in and curtail negative choices. That's really where we are right now. And last time we learned something really powerful. It might be one of the most valuable things about ourselves to know in terms of our personal growth, and that is that there's something called ahava mesuseres. Now, I did mention to you last time that he's going to develop this idea in a lot more detail in chapter 18. Right now we're in chapter 14, but in chapter 18 he's going to develop this idea in a lot more detail, chapters 18 and 19. But the point is that it's a fundamental Jewish belief that every one of us has within ourselves, in our psyche, it's literally wired into our spiritual DNA, love of Hashem. And if you love someone, you're going to behave very differently. So if you love somebody, you're going to do things for them that you wouldn't do for ordinary people. And if you love somebody, you're going to avoid doing things that would upset that person because you don't want to cause them pain, you don't want to jeopardize the relationship. So telling us that we've got this built-in love towards Hashem is quite an empowering thought, even though it's a little bit of a mystifying thought, because what are you talking about? That I have a love of Hashem? I don't know. I've never felt that. I've never experienced it. Where does this come from? How do you know it even exists? It's a nice theory, but how do I know that it's real? And that's really where we are this evening, is at the point of kind of testing that theory and trying to understand what this love means. How do we know that it's present? How do we activate it? And honestly, if every one of us has this great love of Hashem, how come it is that so much of the time we're doing things that Hashem would not approve of? Okay, I know some people will say that that's exactly how marriage works as well. So it's exactly the person who you love that you'll end up doing most of the things that they don't approve of. Fair enough, but that's not a good enough explanation for our relationship with Hashem. So that's what we've got to try and understand. So, if you have a look on page 60, we're going to start. I'm going to start in the middle of a sentence, just because it's going to make sense for what we're doing over here this evening. So it is about 9 lines from the bottom of the page. The first word on the line is the word Yisrael. You see that? First word is the word Yisrael. So he's talking over here about the fact that there's this love of Hashem that is buried inside the heart of every single Jewish person. That's how he gets to the word Yisrael, every single Jewish person. And then the next thing he tells us is, Shenikru oy have shemecha. One of the terms that the Torah uses to refer to us is those who love Hashem's name. Now, we're not going to get into the detail right now why it says loving Hashem's name instead of just saying simply loving Hashem. That is subject for another whole conversation. It's a big area in Hasidus that we're not going to focus on right now. But the point is that one of the ways that the Torah describes us is the lovers of Hashem's name. Or, for the purpose of our conversation, lovers of Hashem. Now comes the part that is particularly relevant. Again, this is self-talk. This is part of a mechanism that a person is supposed to, almost like a script that you're supposed to have in your head, that any time that you feel that you're getting tempted or distracted or maybe going to do something which is contrary to what Hashem wants, this is part of the script that you should tell yourself. The script is, I have a love of Hashem that's built inside of me, so much so that the Torah calls me somebody who loves Hashem. Now, va'afilu kal shebekalim. Kal shebekalim is a very specific term. The word kal, directly translated, means light. So we'd say in English, a lightweight. When you talk about somebody who has no real significance in a particular area, so you might say that somebody is a financial lightweight, as opposed to a big hitter, financial heavyweight. And in the same way, you could even say that a person physically In fact, that's the origin of the term, right? You could be a flyweight in your category. So a kal means somebody who's spiritually a lightweight. They're very spiritually underdeveloped. That's what you call a kal. Kal shebekalim means that out of all of the people who are spiritually underdeveloped, this person would even by their standards be considered underdeveloped. Kal shebekalim, right? The lightest of the lightest, the least of the least. Now, that's maybe not language that we usually use, but effectively what we're describing when we say kal shebekalim is that individual that any one of us would look at and say, that's not, I don't even know if they're really Jewish. That's kind of, how judgmental we might be of them. Kal shebekalim, they don't even rate on the Judaism scale. And every one of us is aware of people like this. Some of the kal shebekalim people that we know, not only are they disengaged from their Judaism, but they might be quite anti-Jewish. We know such people as well. And yet, what he's going to tell us is, Yochol limsor nafshoy al kedushas Hashem. One of the most bizarre things about Jewish people is how we are able, despite all of our hang-ups, despite all of our claims of disassociation or atheism or whatever it is, when push comes to shove, the Jew inside erupts onto the surface, and suddenly the same person who has so many hang-ups about their Judaism is rushing headfirst into the fray and literally ready to die for their Judaism. We've seen this. We've literally seen this in our own experience, and certainly in our history.
But there's some people that, we have also seen some people that are so anti that they don't fit into.
That's right. That is true. So he did not say that every kal shebekalim always dies for their Judaism or sacrifices for their Judaism. The words that he used over here are yochol, is capable of dying for the Judaism. So if we have to be honest about the reality of our history as Jewish people, we do know it's not news. It's something the prophet Isaiah talks about, where he says, those who destroy you will come from within your ranks. And that's been part of Jewish history, unfortunately. Some of the worst people for Jews have been Jews. Consistently through history. At the same time, they've also been a vast minority. In every setting, in every scenario. They've existed, but they've been a minority. I suppose the only place where you could say, well, even there they were a minority, was under Stalin's regime, when you had what they called the Yevsektia, which was the Jewish part of the NKVD, the forerunner to the KGB. And their entire department was focused on only one thing, which was to weed out Jews who remained committed to their Judaism, make their lives an absolute misery, and hand them over to the authorities and make sure that they were sent to Siberia or executed. So maybe there was a larger group of them, but they certainly were not the majority. You think of the kapos in the concentration camps. We don't know that they had an issue with their Judaism. They might have sometimes just been weak in their conviction to stand up for others when they try to protect themselves. So it's more difficult to judge them. Whereas the Yevsektia, they had this mandate, this vendetta against Jewish people, and they dafka wanted to uproot Judaism. So they exist. Nobody's denying that. What we're discussing over here is something incredibly unusual that happens very uniquely in the Jewish world. And that is people who are not engaged, who are not frum, who are not learning or observing, and then they come out of the woodwork, and they are the biggest supporters at all costs of Judaism when there's a crisis. Because if you had to look across other cultures, every single culture has their saints. And many of those saints became saints because they died for the cause. So whether it is the shahid or whether it is the saint, the principle is the same. The only reason that somebody would do that is because they're very dedicated to their beliefs. So therefore they're willing to die for those beliefs. That's not what we're describing over here. That's not a surprise. That's normal. That's across all cultures, all religions. Not only religions. Maybe there's somebody who believes so passionately about environmentalism that they'll glue themselves to the floor.
Never happened.
Right? So I'm not making any commentary over here on whether or not that is something worth gluing yourself to the floor for. But that's the fact that people are so dedicated to their beliefs. But could you imagine, this is how ridiculous it would be, could you imagine the CEO of a big oil company deciding to glue themselves to the floor for an environmental cause, that would be Meshuggah. Right? You never expect such a thing. I don't know if you've seen recently, I don't think I've ever seen in this country before, but there's a billboard for Greenpeace on the highway here. Have you seen it? The billboard for Greenpeace. And I'm thinking, to be perfectly honest, in this country, right now, I don't know if that's the biggest priority. I'm saying that's the biggest priority. Here, the local cause should be, dragging people out of poverty, out of malnutrition, Don't. Anyway, so can you imagine somebody who's a Greenpeace activist says, "That's it. I'm putting my career on the line because I want to buy a private jet." Can you imagine such a thing? Of course you could. So the point is that usually if a person has a particular value set, they're not going to be willing to die for something that doesn't fit that value set. Doesn't make any sense. Jewish history is full, unfortunately, whether it was in the Inquisition or the Crusades or the pogroms or whatever it was. Judaism, unfortunately, our history is full of people who were not champions of Judaism until someone put a sword at their neck. And then they became the frummest Jew you've ever met, and that's often how they died. Under those circumstances. You don't even have to go to that extent. There's a story, happened, I think it was in the 1920s, but it was certainly in the very hectic time of Stalin's purges, when to be an observant Jewish person was an incredibly dangerous thing. And one of the things you were not allowed to do is have a mikveh. So they outlawed the mikvehs and the formal schooling systems. Everything had to go underground. And there were people who built their own mikvehs in the basements of their houses, crazy things like that. Anyway, on this particular occasion, they found a mikveh in a particular town, and they wanted to, the government, or the Yevsektia in particular, they wanted to come up with some kind of a legal argument why they had to shut down the mikveh. Now, bearing in mind that it was not really legal to have a mikveh, so they couldn't keep the highest levels of hygiene. And they decided that they were going to get them on that. They were going to get them on a hygiene, whatever, that hadn't conformed. So they brought water samples into the court, and they called as an expert witness. They called a local doctor who was a Jewish communist. Now, the Jewish communist, firstly, we know that many early communists were Jewish. But this guy, like many of the other intellectual Jewish communists, they were very, very anti-Judaism. So this is a guy who, like, in his mind, the whole concept of the mikveh was archaic and it was nonsensical, and he didn't buy the whole thing. Now he's called as the state's expert witness about the quality of the water, which they were then going to use as their excuse to shut down this mikveh. So he gets up to testify, and he gives his whole testimony about what he had done and tested the water and found this bacteria, and like a whole very, very involved presentation. But at the end of the day, the judge needed an opinion, not just research. So the judge at the end asked him, "What is your expert opinion? Is this water hygienic or is this water contaminated?" So this doctor in front of the court takes the sample of the mikveh water and downs the glass. Up until that point in time, he had zero engagement with his Judaism. But that's what we're saying over here, Kal Shebekalim, that even the least engaged, the least involved, the least educated, most anti-Jewish person, Yachol, it is possible that they would face a situation that they risk everything in order to stand up for Judaism. In fact, I heard a story. It was a really, really amazing story. I hope I can remember all the details. But long story, but I'll tell you very short. There was a guy who landed up in some trouble with the courts in Russia, also in Russia, and when he eventually was brought before the judge, so they had accused him of some criminal activity. He was a frum Jew. They accused him of some criminal activity, and at the end of the day, the judge acquitted him. And when he was leaving the courtroom, it's a long story, but I'm just telling you that when he was leaving the courtroom, the judge handed him a handwritten note. So he looks at the note, and it's a time and an address. So he goes to this guy, it's the judge's house. And the long story short, the judge basically told him that many, many years before he had a particular crisis, and he went to the Friedrich Rebbe, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, and the Rebbe had helped him. And he wasn't a judge at that point. He was like maybe just starting out his legal career. And the Rebbe told him, one day, if you are given a challenge to risk your position for your fellow Jew, do it. And that was that. That was like his only engagement really with with Judaism. And then all these years later, here he is presiding as a judge, and this Jewish guy is brought up, which he understood obviously that the charges were trumped up, but at the same time he was going against the prosecution, which could have, Russia's a funny place, could have lost him everything. He lost him his job. He could have been imprisoned or whatever. And he remembered what the previous Rebbe had told him: when the time comes that you might have to risk everything for your fellow Jew, go ahead and did it. So he did. You think about it, like, do you think any of us would necessarily do that? That's the surprising thing about this love of Hashem that lies inside of us. It's unpredictable. You don't know when it's going to rear its head. You don't know how it's going to look when it does manifest. And so anything could happen. Anything could happen. So this is a script of self-talk that a person is supposed to tell themselves, which is to say, here I am, right now, I am committed. That's why I'm learning this stuff, because I have a level of commitment, and I care about my Judaism, and I'm trying to do my best, and I'm trying to improve, and I'm trying to grow, and whatever the case is. Now that guy who's not trying anything, who's actually fighting against Judaism, when he's put into a corner, is going to come out guns blazing for his Judaism. Should I be any less committed than he is? That's the self-talk. That's a script that we're supposed to use. So can you imagine if a person is feeling, gee, maybe I'll do something that I know that the Torah does not approve of, and then we remind ourselves, well, there's that guy who I'm so judgmental of about how removed he is from his Judaism, but when his challenge comes, he's going to step up to the plate, likely that he'll step up to the plate in a way that's going to embarrass me. But here I am, this committed Jew, and the challenge that's come my way is far less of a challenge when I'm not going to step up to the plate. So that's the script that a person's supposed to have running in their minds. But you have to acknowledge why it is that we do things that are unhealthy. Like I always say, to me, one of the most bizarre things in life is the warning on a cigarette box. Why is it so bizarre?
So they don't care, they put it on.
That's what I'm saying. It's never done one thing to sales. I don't know the statistics, but to me it looks like the cigarette companies are still fine. They don't have the Marlboro Man on all the billboards, and they still seem to be fine. It's fascinating, right? But the thing that fascinates me more than anything else is what goes through a person's mind when you read the box that says smoking kills.
They're not reading it.
And then
They're not reading it.
They're not reading it. It doesn't matter reading or not reading it. It's become so much part of the narrative and part of what goes through a person's mind that you say, this is an unhealthy choice, I'm going to have another cigarette. What goes through a person's mind? Now, the reason I'm asking that question is not to judge people for smoking. It's to identify something that is common to all human beings. The incredible capacity that we have to excuse bad choices. It must be one of the most common human experiences. And we have this incredible capacity to justify bad choices, to excuse bad choices. And we're doing it all the time. It could be as simple as the person in today's world who knows that they should really go to sleep, but instead of going to sleep, sits there watching TikToks. It's not a sound decision. It's not a rational decision. And yet somehow we have the capacity to convince ourselves that it's okay to do it. You see the same thing, for example, with money. I know that I shouldn't spend on X because it's not really worth the investment and I don't really have the budget, but right now I feel like I want it. What is it about human beings that we make unhealthy choices? So he's going to tell us over here, not so much in the context of the human experience generally, but much more in the context of the Jewish experience. So what does he say? Elo shenichnas boi ruach shtus. The only reason that a person ever makes an unhealthy choice is because at the time that they make that choice, their mind is not operating at full rational level. What he calls here ruach shtus, a spirit of foolishness. There's a foolish moment What's been a foolish
Lots of
moment?
foolish moments all day.
A lot of foolish moments. Exactly. So in the secular court system, one of the strongest excuses that we'd use to protect a criminal is temporary insanity. And in the Jewish criminal system, the only reason anybody would ever be in the courts must be temporary insanity. In other words, temporary insanity would not be a mitigating force in how we judge a case, because we assume that every poor decision is temporary insanity. What's the definition of insanity? Not thinking rationally. Sanity is to think about things rationally. Insanity is not to think about things rationally. Right? Any self-destructive choice is, if I'm objective about it, insane. Sugar, why are you doing this? Why are you self-sabotaging? Doesn't make any sense. So when it comes to this understanding that we all have a love of Hashem inside of ourselves, and yet we consistently do things that are not good for our souls and that don't improve our relationship with Hashem and are contrary to the Torah, we have to ask ourselves the question, something doesn't make sense over here. There's the guy who doesn't learn, who doesn't go to shul, who has hang-ups with the whole system of Judaism and every rabbi, and that guy, in case of emergency, is going to shatter the glass, literally, and put his life on the line for Judaism. And me, all I'm tackling right now is, like, I should really be at the minyan, but I'm not there. Or I shouldn't speak Lashon Hara, but I'm sharing the story anyway. Or I know that I shouldn't eat this, but I'm going to eat it. Why is that? So he says that is what we call ruach shtus, foolishness. Now, what is foolishness? And that's why I go back to the smoking example. Does one cigarette kill? When they say in the box, smoking kills, does one cigarette kill? No, of course not. If a person smokes a certain amount on a regular basis over a period of time, then there's a pretty good chance it's going to affect their health. Even that's not a great guarantee. Some people have very interesting biology, and it doesn't affect them. They smoke till their last day at 103.
And they didn't die from that.
Exactly. And that's a fact. Because different people have different makeups and different DNA, and that's a fact. You know, there's a story of two Hasidim. This is not hundreds of years ago. This is contemporary. The story must have happened in like the 80s. Two Hasidim sitting in 770, both from Russia, both had put their lives on the line for many years to keep Judaism alive in Russia. And they eventually got out to the United States, and they would sit every single morning in 770 and learn together and have a schnapps. And the schnapps that they had was what's called 96. 96 is 96 proof. That's like, right?
It's for cleaning. It's mess.
Yeah.
It's for cleaning.
That's what happens when you come out of Russia. So one day, and they both lived to I think one lived over 100, if I'm not mistaken, out of the two. One day, the one guy develops a bit of an issue with his knee, and it gets worse and worse. Eventually, he goes to the doctor. The doctor tells him he's got water on the knee. He says, I always knew that 4% was going to get me. So what? No single glass of alcohol damages somebody's liver. No single cigarette damages a person's lungs. So what's the foolishness that gets into us? The foolishness is not to notice the cumulative effects of what we do. That's foolishness. Foolishness is to downplay. Well, they said that Einstein once said that compound interest is the most misunderstood or underestimated, I don't remember which word he used, force in the universe. Well, what's the big deal? So I'm going to pay a little bit of interest. You don't realize the cumulative effect. So what's the reason that people do things that are not healthy, even when they know they're not healthy? Because they convince themselves we haven't hit critical mass. I know it's wrong, but it's not going to destroy me. I'll fix it later. Right? I'll fix it later. Okay, so I don't... not going to say you don't remember your anniversary, you'll fix it later. That I'm not so sure about. Certain things are not so cumulative.
No, when you forget it year on year, that's cumulative.
I know, but you should survive that long to forget year on year. But the guy who doesn't brush his teeth and goes to the dentist, and the dentist says everything's fine. So in his mind, you don't have to brush your teeth. 5 years later, he's going to have a root canal. The guy who doesn't ever put away money says, but right now I'm fine. One day he's got to retire. Got nothing there. The person, right? So shtus, foolishness, doesn't mean that we're idiots. It just means that we take a short-sighted view of the impact of things that we're doing. So what does Ruach Shtus mean over here? Let's see, he read it inside. What is the Ruach Shtus? What is this foolishness that he's describing? V'nid be'eloi, is that a person convinces themselves, yes, I'm doing something contrary to what Hashem wants, but I'm still Jewish. I'm no less Jewish than I was before. They haven't struck me from the role. Even the person can say, I'm still frum. Yes, I did something I'm not supposed to do, but I'm still a frum guy. I still keep Shabbos and kosher, and I have good mezuzahs and good tefillin, and a whole list of things. So the foolishness is to disregard the impact of a single action. Why? Firstly, because they're cumulative, and secondly, because when you're dealing with spiritual things, the effects are immediate. Now, why do I say cumulatively? Much later on in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe is going to speak about the fact that the Torah compares the neshama to a rope. And a rope is always made out of many strands that have to be spun together into a single rope. So you nick one strand and you say, it's okay, the rope is still fine. And then you nick the next strand and you say, but it's okay, the rope is still fine. And eventually you nick enough strands and the rope is going to snap. So that's the cumulative effect. That's the foolishness of not realizing the cumulative effect. I do one thing that's not healthy for my neshama, and then I do another thing that's not healthy, and eventually it's all going to build up, and one day it's going to overrun me completely. But there's something else over here. Person thinks that I could do an Avera and it's not going to create any barrier between me and God. Now, let's use an example of something that we can all relate to. Person thinks, I'm going to do something that an individual in my life who I care about, so it could be a dear friend, it could be my spouse, it could be my child, or whatever, somebody who I really care about, I'm going to do something that I know that irritates them. But it's okay, it's not going to affect our relationship. So yes, cumulatively it will, but not only cumulatively. Right now, the fact is I've created some kind of a barrier in our relationship. Even if it's a very thin barrier, the fact is I've created a barrier. So it's the same thing between me and Hashem. Hashem says, do X. And I decide I'm not doing X. That there's no option that's going to drive some level of a wedge in between our relationship. Right? Or either Hashem wants me to do something and I don't do it, or Hashem says I shouldn't do something and I do it. Either way, I'm driving a wedge. So that's the foolishness. The foolishness is to think just because I'm comfortable with my choice, it means that there's no repercussion. That's nonsense. I don't get to decide if there's a repercussion or not. These are dynamics of the universe that happen whether or not I approve of them. So this is the script that we should have in our heads. Here I am. I'm feeling right now distracted. I'm feeling right now tempted to do something which is contrary to what Hashem wants, or to avoid doing something which is what Hashem wants. And what's going through my mind? I have to remind myself. The problem is that I've convinced myself that this won't do any damage to me. That is inaccurate. And if there was somebody who was far less qualified than me, and they realized that they were going to damage their relationship with Hashem, they would pull out all the stops to make sure that doesn't happen. I have to remind myself this is actually going to do some damage. And the other reason that people do things which they should not do is because they lose sight of the fact that they actually do have a love of Hashem inside of themselves, in exactly the same way as it is in a relationship. Sometimes people have been together for a long time and they forget that they love each other. And because of that, they become abrasive to each other and impatient with each other. They forget that they love each other. It can happen. So I have to know that it's possible that I forget that I love Hashem. I know it sounds funny to say that I've forgotten that I love Hashem, but it's a real thing. I forget that this is who I am. And I don't, please God, need somebody else, some anti-Semite, to come and remind me that I love Hashem. That's not an ideal situation. I have to rely on an anti-Semite to remind me to love Hashem. But the person has to tell themselves, I don't want to be foolish. So that concludes the script. So the script that we're supposed to use in our mind. Anytime that we feel that we are about to do something which the Torah would not approve of, or we're going to avoid doing something that the Torah expects of us, we have to tell ourselves, a guy who's less engaged in their Judaism would stand up to protect their relationship with Hashem. I am foolish in believing that this is not going to interfere with that relationship. Therefore, if I just remind myself that this is bad for the relationship, that this is going to cause some level of disconnect, some level of friction between me and Hashem, then I'll make sure not to do X and Y. Now, why is this all important for us? Because he's explaining how anybody could become a Benoni, because anybody could train themselves to have this kind of thought process that they use whenever they are confronted with a challenge.
That's why we can't be a Benoni.
That's why we can. We can.
But when we're foolish, we can't.
Correct. But any person is capable of challenging themselves to come up with a system that they could use with a little bit of focus and a little bit of discipline, not to fall into the trap of foolishness. Why we can't be a tzaddik, that he'll explain in the next piece. The big difference between a Benoni and a tzaddik, but that we'll do next time because we did get a little bit of a late start and we have to go to the next year.
Yep.